Thanks for coming back to another episode of Pitch It, a fintech conversation amongst founders, investors, and friends. I'm your host, Todd Anderson, Chief Content Officer at Fintech Nexus. And what we do is we take a peek behind the curtain. What motivates someone to start a company? How do investors make the right bet? What do accelerators do during and help enabling the process of growing your company? How do banks think of founders? Not to mention, we try to have some fun, and what you'll see is we'll also do some special episodes. We have some new features coming. So stick with us, and you'll get all you'll need to know about the fintech startup landscape. Pitch It is really a part of a larger podcast network here at Fintech Nexus. You can go to my colleague Peter, our co-founder and chairman, for Fintech One-on-One. You can subscribe to his feed, or we have our newest podcast by one of our writers, Isabel Castro, the Fintech Coffee Break. For everything produced by Fintech Nexus, you can check out Fintech Nexus Podcast, which is really our content fire hose. All shows, webinar replays, even in-person event content, not to mention our weekly news show. As always, we hope that you rate the show and write a review. I try to really take listener feedback seriously, and as it helps make the show better. You can also follow the podcast and all of our podcasts on the feed of your choice, whether it be Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen, or come directly to news.fintechnexus.com. Now, let's get on with the show. Before we get into today's episode, as always, just a reminder, you can follow the show by following me on Twitter at Todd Fintech, or you can check us out on LinkedIn. Just search Todd Anderson with Fintech Nexus. On today's episode, I was joined by Andrew Brown, founder and CEO of Check. The Check platform makes embedded payroll possible. Check helps leading companies launch a successful payroll business in a fraction of the time for a fraction of the cost. And really, when we talk about Check, we're talking about two of the hottest areas within fintech. Embedded products, which has really taken off in recent years and helped enable companies like Check to even exist and have these types of offerings, as well as payroll. Payroll is still clearly a huge barrier to so many different companies, especially now as we moved into a time where a lot of companies are dealing with distributed workforces, which includes lots of different tax jurisdictions and lots of different implications for where their employees might be and what they have to consider. Check enables companies to offer payroll within a suite of management tools. And really what Check is a platform of platforms that ultimately helps that small business owner focus on how they can grow their company, make new products, focus really on their business, and not spend time, kind of comparing spreadsheets and whatnot when it comes to payroll. Andrew and I discussed the fragmented payroll market, the future of the payday, the larger embedded finance trend, stories from the fundraising trail, and much, much more. I hope you enjoy the episode, and as always, don't forget to rate the show. Without further ado, Andrew Brown, founder and CEO of Check. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew. How are you?
Hi, Todd. Good morning. Thanks for having me on. Doing well today.
Of course. Thanks for coming. We're in between Christmas and New Year's. And so this episode will probably come out a little bit after the new year. But, I'd like to kick things off with just tell the audience, tell me a little bit about your background and ultimately what led you to the point of starting Check and kind of what was the thinking behind that move.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a technologist by background. I'm the type of person as a kid, played a lot of video games, that got me into computers and I think really introduced, a love of technology. That led me to start now two different companies. The first one was about a year after graduating from college and it was called Oyster. It was totally unrelated to the business Check that I run today. Oyster was actually a consumer ebook subscription business. So think Netflix or Spotify, but for ebooks, $10 a month, and had access to more than 1 million books in our catalog. So ran that for about 4 years before ultimately selling it to Google. Um, it was an incredible experience. That first time really building something from scratch, learning what it means to be a founder, raising money, building a team, the whole thing. It was, I don't know, 6 different educations all wrapped up into one. Coming out of it, I was tired, so I needed a little bit of a break. But two, I was just so into it. I knew I wanted to do that again, but knew I wanted to do it not in the consumer space. I'm a developer by background. Was always excited about sort of developer-oriented tools. I was an econ double major in college, loved thinking about kind of the way money moved around the economy. And so, coming out of that experience was really focused on, okay, what is the right kind of founder market fit? What are the types of things that are going to be right for me to go run going forward? And, a couple of steps on, that's what led us to Check.
So what is it about building, being a founder, entrepreneurship that kind of drew you in that direction? Is there family founders? Kind of what brought you to, hey, I want to build companies versus going working for a Google or a Facebook with your tech background?
Yeah, it's funny. The short answer is no. There's not a family, certainly tech background there. I'm from South Carolina. Um, I had never, been to California, didn't know Stanford existed or really anything about Silicon Valley. Like even when I got to college, and my parents are both labor and employment lawyers, both also grew up in South Carolina. And so the labor and employment thing comes back around. That's actually proved quite helpful in the context of running a payroll company. But the flip side of that is they're fundamentally small business people. I think they've had an entrepreneurial streak. I've had multiple other, kind of small business entrepreneurs in my family. And I think that core just, independent streak, not working for the man, that sort of thing, that absolutely, has flown through and runs pretty deep in my DNA and is a core part of what motivates me now at Check.
So tell us a little bit more about Check, exactly what you guys do, and while answering that, how did you ultimately come to the name Check?
Yeah, naming is always one of the hardest parts of any company.
Yep.
But first, what do we do? Check is a platform for building new payroll businesses and products. So let me break that down a little bit because we're
Mhm.
really the first company of our kind, and so I think most people don't know much about the space. The way to understand this is if you rewind 100 years, you could hire someone, off the street to work in your restaurant, hand them cash at the end of the day, and you were done. That was really all that was required of you as the business owner. And it was a very simple economic transaction between an employer and an employee.
Yep.
Over the ensuing 100 years, that's become extremely complicated as a result of all the federal, state, and local taxes and other regulations that have been put into place, which are critically important. They really power, much of our modern economy and especially our social safety net. Literally things like the vast majority of child support is paid through that system, things like that people don't realize that are just crucial to our social fabric. And that's all great, but it makes it a lot harder to run your business. As a
Mhm.
business owner now, there's a whole long list of things you got to worry about beyond just finding someone, agreeing on a wage rate with them and paying them those funds. Um, as a result of all that complexity, what's happened is these business owners over the last 10 years, they've come online, they've begun to use platforms, many of them customers of ours like Homebase, to power their small business, but payroll is still separate. It's still stuck in a, 1980s, 1990s type of style where you're doing it in a kind of monolithic other service that's been around for 50 plus years. And it's just not integrated into the modern tooling that they like to use. And so what Check does is we are a back-end platform that makes it possible for other software companies to build these new payroll businesses that they're offering to their small business customers.
So when it comes to the payroll aspect, what are kind of the biggest impediments? Is it time? Is it, the fact that, like you said, it's siloed and most people are probably using spreadsheets in some way, or a lot of, at least the smallest of the small companies are probably still stuck in spreadsheets and trying to compare things. What else is kind of the big things that hurt businesses when it comes to figuring out how to integrate payroll?
Yeah. So the first, like, kind of most important problem to understand is just pure geographic complexity. So there are thousands, approaching 10,000 different tax jurisdictions all across the US. Certain states, like Pennsylvania, for example, actually fund public schools with payroll taxes. So literally down to the school district level, it might be you live on one side of the street, you have to pay one payroll tax. You live on another side of the street, you have to pay a different payroll tax, that sort of thing. That's the first thing that makes it, really complex for these businesses to actually manage. So that's number one. Number two is, to your point about spreadsheets, basically, what is the core tool that they're using to capture time and just generally manage their workforce on a day-to-day basis? That might be a spreadsheet. Increasingly, though, it's not a spreadsheet. It's a modern software tool. And that's really where our opportunity comes in. We work with those modern tools that are now capturing time, doing workforce management, to enable them to not stop at a time card, but to actually go all the way through and actually, move money and provide that payroll service to the small business owner, ultimately saving the small business owner a whole heck of a lot of time in their day.
Is the target is ultimately the target customer. Is there a minimum, like, size of business, maximum size of business? Kind of where do you and your platform fit within kind of the overall business market? And does it even matter, as long as you're a small business, can you integrate with something like you guys?
Yeah. So we're a platform of platforms. So our platform customers, they are typically software companies. I would call it at the mid stage or later. That's not always true. There are, certain handful of companies who are kind of brand new, pre-seed type startups that want payroll to be, really core to their business from the beginning, who we work with. But typically you're talking a Series B company or later as our core customer. And their customers look very different though. They're typically serving often your traditional sort of blue collar, real world Main Street type business. Think, your local restaurant, your local
Mhm.
retail shop, coffee shop, tradespeople, construction workers, those sorts of things. That's the substantial majority of the types of businesses that we serve.
How much, or how much has the trend in the direction of embedded finance, embedded technologies really helped enable what you guys provide? Because I would presume a few years ago, it's not as simple to think of the concept of what you guys are doing, into these businesses that you guys work with, and ultimately being a platform of platforms. What has that shift in the market meant for not only your business, but more generally the thought of embedded technologies?
Yeah, there's no question that this is a, macro movement that's much broader than not just any one company, but any one particular type of financial technology. It really goes back to, that core shift that I was explaining that's happened over the last 10 years. If you go back to 2010, most of these businesses truly were offline. They were run on spreadsheets. Maybe they had a credit card reader if they were lucky. Fast forward, that is, by and large changed and is still continuing to change rapidly. Those companies now use usually some type of software platform, and especially the newest businesses that are getting built, are using another platform. What that's done is it's opened up that opportunity for, embedded finance players of all types, whether that be payroll, which is what we provide, or lending services or banking services, or, there's a whole host of others. Insurance is another example. It's created really the opportunity in the surface area to actually deliver those financial products to these small businesses in the tool that they're already using every day and co-located, exactly alongside all of their existing business data. So there's no question we're all, riding the same wave, pushing the same wave forward. And I mean, I can just compare to back 3.5, 4 years ago, and was first starting the company and trying to explain it to folks, the most common reaction was sort of a blank look, like, what do you mean? Who are these software platforms? What does embedding something in them even mean? What does that look like? And, it's definitely a very, very different story today.
I mean, if we look like 10 years in the future, in terms of payroll, does it look closer to the version that you guys helped enable, or is it still a mix of like the ADPs of the world and kind of these old school type players, and then the version that you guys help enable? Kind of what does the payroll market look like if we're trying to forecast sometime in the future, like a decade from now?
Yeah, I think if you look 10 years out, you're going to see that the largest of absolute number of small businesses really have payroll fading into the background. It's not a tool that they go out and purchase and that they're really worried about on a day-to-day basis. It is baked in to the software that they're already using, in an embedded fashion that we're providing. That said, payroll is an incredibly fragmented market and
Yeah.
a slow moving space. So ADP is the biggest player. They have on the order of 15% market share and are about $100 billion company. So I'm not going to tell you that 10 years out, Chuck will have 80% market share and power everyone, but I believe, we'll power millions of small businesses at that point.
What else, when you think, if it does fade to the background, and that vision, begins to come true for a lot more companies, how else does that help enable the business when something like that is kind of offloaded from the, I guess, day-to-day mind of the executives and the team of a business? And what does that mean to have it fade in the background and kind of just operate? What else can that unlock for companies?
Yeah, I think there's two or three levels of this. First, I'll focus on that small business owner. The core thing there is just unlocking their time. When you imagine someone who's running a, 5, 10, 15 person type company, they don't have one job. They have 35 different
Yeah.
jobs, right? From doing PR to, head of HR to, the person that's, the in charge of cooking the burgers, whatever the case might be. They have no shortage of other things they need to be doing. And so when you take payroll from being a multi-hour headache on a weekly or bi-weekly basis and turn it into a couple of minutes, where they reallocate that time is obviously up to them, whether it's spending time with their family or whether it's investing it back into their business. But that's the first most important thing, and we see that happening already. I mean, one of my favorite customer quotes from one of our partners recently was they had a business in Texas, and the owner actually ran payroll while sitting on the back of his horse. I think that's a perfect example of like how easy we can make it and how much you can really, in concert, with our platform partners, really distill down all of that complexity and make it just super, super simple for the business owner. So that's layer one. That's what happens for that business owner. I think for the employee is the next thing to understand for folks working for these small businesses. Too often, like they're getting gypped, like the business owners themselves don't understand necessarily what's going on. And so either they get paid the wrong amounts just accidentally, but that
Yeah.
creates a real short-term pain point on them. The pay cycles are too long. They aren't able to have sort of the kind of best set of benefits that they otherwise could, these sorts of things. And embedded payroll and more broadly, this, embedded finance theme that we've been talking about is going to, I think, ultimately help employees in a pretty dramatic fashion. You will see faster pay cycles. You will see just accurate pay. You'll see folks getting better benefits, all of those things. And if I can, I'll add one third layer, which is, take one step back, pull back from the small businesses. I think it's important to focus on our platform customers too, these other software businesses. For them, these embedded technologies and embedded payroll in particular are just absolutely massive for their businesses, right? It's a new revenue stream for them. And it is payroll in particular is an incredibly low churn product. And so it helps them really deepen the relationship with their customers and keep them around for longer. That's something that can really transform your business as a software platform from being more of a, I'll call it an add-on nice tool for the business to have, to be really the core operating system for these small businesses, which is just an incredibly powerful place to be.
How far, your mention of pay cycles kind of leads into my next question, which is, how far away do you think we are from essentially payroll on demand if I'm an employee? Like, hey, yes, that maybe there's a 2 week cycle that's quote unquote the normal cycle, but where I can pull from I know some companies offer it now, most do it, like, I think Walmart does it 3 times a year without a fee, and then if you want to do it other than those 3 times, you have to pay a fee. But how far away do you think we are from kind of payroll on demand and people almost accessing their money daily if they want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it. I would describe it best as, the famous quote that in technology, the future is already here, but it's just not evenly distributed. I think that is absolutely the case in terms of on-demand access to wages. I mean, you could look and just see the number of, physical brick and mortar, payday loan shops that are out there, and understand just how important the need is for this type of service, how high the demand is. And you can look at the interest rates those folks charge, and, how in many cases, they're really taking advantage of folks, how much better the technology solutions to it can be. And so, it's already very large. There are, several, quite big companies now providing the service, companies that are really taking advantage of it. What I see going forward is two things. Number one, over the last, let's call it half decade or so, it's become much more prevalent in the largest companies, with in particular the largest blue collar workforces. Those are the employees who typically need access to those wages faster. And it's the companies for whom attracting those employees is really important, and being able to retain them is really important too. The trend that I see over the next half decade is that same service becoming much more prevalent in the small business space as well. Over the last few years, there just haven't been the tools in place to enable most small businesses to offer that type of wage advance service. And by virtue of Check and other companies in the ecosystem, Claire is one that we're close to and have a partnership with. We're making that much more accessible to folks.
How big of an issue is for the employee ultimately, who's receiving their paycheck? Is transparency still an issue? I mean, I know for me and in our business, I can log into one of our PEO, I think it is, and I can see my paycheck and everything, but not everyone A knows that they can do that, or B even has that option. And so when they get their paycheck, it's, this lump sum at the end. But do you think transparency would help this market, more transparency? And how much do employees still feel like they're kind of a bit in the dark after they just receive their pay? But kind of what happened in between the taxes taken out, the benefits, all that. I mean, I would assume more transparency would be more beneficial.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, more transparency is almost always better than less. Certainly in this case, it absolutely is. I don't think it is the biggest problem that most, workers out there are facing. That said, I think it is absolutely something folks would like to have. And there's transparency, and then there's also explainability. I
Mm.
think just being able to see your pay stub is one thing. Being able to actually understand what's on the pay stub and why it's there, and how that might change next week or next month, I think is a whole other story. And frankly, none of the tools out there have really been built to help workers understand that. And that's part of what we do. Like our core thesis with Check, the thing we believe more than anything else, is that payroll at the end of the day is actually a pretty sort of simple. I mean, it's complex, but it's conceptually a simple, pretty commoditized service. You are calculating taxes across thousands of different jurisdictions, moving money, and filing the tax forms of those jurisdictions. Every payroll company today is trying to reinvent the wheel by doing that same thing a little bit better. Our view is that's just totally the wrong way to go. What we've done is we've built a platform, aimed at these other software companies that developers can, not focus on all the basic commoditized pieces of payroll. They can focus on exactly these sorts of things. How do you explain, and show pay stubs better, help folks understand their wages, give them faster access to their wages, reduce the time these business owners are spending all the actually, interesting stuff at the frontier of how businesses are run, while offloading the complex but ultimately commoditized pieces to check.
What's the biggest or one of the biggest lessons that you've learned about check since you launched?
I think I'd say it's really the importance and simultaneously the challenge of managing across different time frames. What I mean by that is you have to execute with just extreme urgency on a daily, if not hourly basis, while also ensuring that you're doing that with a consistent, call it 3 to 5 year type time horizon in mind from a strategic perspective. In payroll, that's really hard because again, so much of the nature of the business is you are reactive to changes in local rules and regulations. Over the last 3 to 4 years, we've gone through COVID has been the biggest event across the world, and for payroll, that meant so many different jurisdictions all across the country were passing, specific COVID sick pay rules. And that wasn't something that was
Yeah.
certainly on our roadmap or that you plan for, but you have to add support for those. And it's, crucial to businesses that you do so. And so, figuring out how to run the company, keep that in mind while still playing the long game has, I think was and continues to be an ongoing challenge.
Do you have a biggest regret a regret that you can share?
Oh, that's the tough one. I mean, there's so many different things that I think you go back and would probably do a little bit differently. I think for me, the biggest one is I tend to think of check in sort of years. We started right near the beginning of 2019, so we're coming up, right on the end of our first year. To me, if I had to go back, one that I would do differently would be our second year. That was when COVID hit, and as a result, we were small. We started the year with 4 or 5 people, ended the year with 15 people, something like that. We were still in stealth at that point in time. And I think the thing I would do a little bit differently is I think we were a little bit too conservative. And look, I'd always rather be a little bit too conservative probably than a little too aggressive.
Hmm.
But given the way the market has played out, the opportunity that's in front of us, and even looking back at what we knew at that point in time, we're executing against just this massive industry and massive problem that's going to take a decade plus. And I think we could have actually invested a little bit more ahead in that year, which would have led us to have to catch up a little bit less in year number three.
Best piece of advice you received since launching?
The one that I always come back to that I kind of have to relearn over and over again is that people are everything. And especially as you start to scale your business, that's doubly true. When you're maybe pre-seed and 5 or 10 people, your core team is crucial and is going to determine, whether you make it to the next stage or not. But what they're each doing. You can, micromanage to a fairly substantial degree there if you really want to. Not that I would encourage it, but that just breaks once you start to get to, 20, 25 people, much less, about 100 people where we are today, or, certainly as you grow beyond that too. And so having that next level of leaders who, you'd trust with your life, who, you would found another company with, who, if they, quit tomorrow, you'd want to go invest your life savings in because they would be successful. Those are the folks that drive the business forward and that are responsible for just an absolutely massive portion of your ultimate outcome, whether that be, success or failure or somewhere in between. And so truly, I think it is almost impossible to invest too much time in finding the right people, cultivating them, bringing them on, and helping them grow and succeed over time.
Speaking of people, who are the people that surround you? What does the team look like? You mentioned it's around 100 today. Kind of what's the breakdown? Engineers, kind of where does the team sit as we kind of about to hit almost your 4 year anniversary?
Yeah, so Check's about 100 people today, as I mentioned. We've been a distributed company from the beginning. We do have hubs with offices here in New York, where I'm based, as well as in San Francisco, but still the majority of the team is located elsewhere across probably 30 or so states at this point, as well as a number of folks in Canada too. And that's been, I think, actually a really beneficial thing for us because, again, payroll is so local. Being able to hire folks who have local expertise, have actually dealt with, the regulators and the agencies in each of these states has been really, really beneficial for us. In terms of roles and functions, we're a technology company, so as you'd expect, call it roughly half the company sits in some type of engineering or product type function. I think one thing that's different for Check is that we do have, both from a compliance perspective and an operations perspective, just the need for a ton of payroll expertise in the business as well. And so that's something that we actually include those functions as part of our core product development teams. They're not some separate support org. They sit, in some cases literally, in other cases metaphorically, right next to our engineers and right next to our product people.
I know that you guys have raised, some outside capital. How was, the fundraising, process for you? And ultimately, we have a lot of founders that listen to the show. What piece of advice might you give for someone who might be, going out for their first fundraising, or just generally kind of what you learn about Check during that process?
Yeah. So for context, we've raised 4 rounds of capital at this point, about $119 million in total, and are really fortunate to be backed by, some of the best investors out there, folks like Stripe, Thrive Capital, Bedrock, Index, I could go on. And I think I've learned a few things from raising each of those rounds. The first thing is that, but we were very fortunate that in the early days, fundraising was relatively easy for us because so much of what folks are investing in is really, again, it goes back to people. I think the best
Yeah.
investors understand that. And as a second time founder, someone that had, a reasonable amount of success before, and that was teaming up with the same people that I had worked with before, it made those early rounds easy. In our case, actually, our first 2 rounds were led by one of my best friends who was my co-founder and CEO of my first company, and now is a co-founder lead investor in Check as well. So, you kind of in life look for your unfair advantages and really exploit them for all they're worth. That was one of ours and one that really helped. The piece of advice that I would give to other folks is, understand that investing is really a relationship game, especially at the early to mid stages. You have to have, don't get me wrong, you're ultimately building a great business and you have to understand your market and be able to execute against it. But so much of what these folks are investing in early on is people and your trajectory as a founder, which ultimately becomes extrapolated into the trajectory of the company. And so what I mean by that and how that's played out for us, again, our first couple rounds were led by someone I was very close to, but actually each subsequent round after that has also been led by someone who I've known for probably at least a year, usually multiple years at that point, and often who participated in a smaller way in one of our prior rounds too. So that's been the strategy that I've used, and it's partially a how do you fundraise strategy. It's also a, who are you working with after you fundraise? I think sometimes folks get a little wrapped around the axle and trying to get the raise done. And you got to realize, fundraises, and especially if you end up with folks on your board, it's like a marriage, or frankly harder to break up than a marriage, right? So is that the person that you want to have in your ear all the time? And are they going to add value to the business? Those are really critical questions to consider and understand.
Before we shift to the final few questions, which are a bit lighter and more fun, any fundraising horror stories or just a bad experience that you could share?
I mean, look, as I mentioned, we've been really, really fortunate to have, relatively easy fundraisers all along. That said, there are always ups and downs, these things, you never know how they're going to go. And so, our last fundraise, I'll just give one example. We closed it on December 23rd last year. And, it's any deal, I think, when you're trying to push it to the finish line, there's a question, is it going to get done that day? Is it going to get pushed a day, a few weeks, that sort of thing. And, in this case, we really, relative to the macro environment, timed it perfectly, but we're starting to see some of the deterioration. And, given the holidays that were coming up, wanted to make sure that we got it done ahead of the holidays. We didn't want to wait multiple weeks. And so, that was a nerve-wracking process, to be sure, trying to, dot every I and cross every T to get things across the finish line.
So, final few questions. Like I mentioned, a bit lighter. Do you have a favorite book or the last book that you read?
Oh, yeah, I think the last book I read was Barbarian Days by William Finnegan, who's a staff writer at the New Yorker. And it's in a lot of ways an escapist book. William's a surfer, and well, before becoming a writer, I guess, was a surfer and still is as a hobby, and spent 10 plus years in his 20s traveling all over the world, really kind of in pursuit of this passion that he loved. And I read it on vacation. I think it was just this amazing book that really transported you to a different place, a different time, and helped, for me, I love people who are just in stories about someone who's really passionate about something and really chasing that dream. And this was, exactly that type of book. So I loved it and highly recommend it to folks.
Founders clearly work hard, and most days they don't have enough time in the day, but they also need to stay fresh and sharp. What do you do to kind of step away, ensure that you're not overdoing it, and kind of unwind?
Yeah, I mean, love to spend time with my fiance, whether that's going out to dinner or, watching a movie or something. So that's probably number one. I think the other thing for me personally, it's just something that takes my mind off of work. And someone, I don't know, a while back taught me a phrase, calls it alternative stress. Yeah, I think for me, if I'm just sitting around, like, relax, it doesn't feel relaxing. I need something else to be focused on. And for me, that's often sports. I'm a huge sport fan, almost, any type of sport you can think of, whether it's the, basketball or football or the World Cup, whatever it might be. And so, watching whatever game is on or listening to, podcast recaps of my favorite teams, that's the kind of stuff that really helps me, turn my brain off.
Perfect segue, because my next question was, who's your favorite team or teams that you root for?
Yeah, so I'm a Duke guy, and I am a diehard Duke basketball fan. So I spent 2 months camping out to be in the front row for the Duke Carolina game. Back when
Wow.
I was in school. So yeah, truly diehard fan there.
The couple of final questions as we wrap up. Do you have a favorite vacation spot?
I love to travel. There's so many places in the world that I really appreciate going. If I had to pick one, I would say it's actually Hilton Head, South Carolina. So I'm from the upstate of South Carolina, and Hilton Head is a beach town, an island,
Yep.
off the coast there. And I started going as a small child. Went every summer with my parents for a week, and it's now a family tradition. We kind of all congregate there, each June. And one, it's just, obviously, beach is a good place to relax. It's a fun time, but more than that, I think, as we all get a little bit older, you come to appreciate that time with, my parents, my brothers, my sisters, and some of my extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, that sort of thing. It's just a really, really warm, loving time. And so that's probably my highlight.
And then final question, biggest inspiration in life. What inspires you?
I feel like that's an almost impossible question. I truly, I take inspiration from so many different people and things, different walks of life. If I had to pick one, sort of what I think is the most common sort of thing or person that I probably return to for, kind of wisdom and learnings, I'll go back to sports fandom and Duke. It's Coach K, and bummed that he retired last year. But for me, when you look at someone like that who had, 3 or 4 decades of just truly, outstanding, top of their field performance through, probably 3 or 4 different, generational changes in their field, and sort of how he did that, which, yes, was X's and O's, but more than that, I think was being just a really deep, having a deep understanding of people and being an incredible motivator of people. That to me is just incredibly inspiring, something I try and learn from and apply on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, the trick of sustained success is not easy. It's a lot easier to have 2 or 3 good years, but 30 or 40 is certainly exceptional. But
Totally.
Andrew, I appreciate you coming on the show. If someone wanted to reach out, find you or find Check, how would they do that? How can they get in touch?
Yeah, absolutely. So check is checkhq.com. So, easy to find there. I'm at almost ABC. My initials are ABC. So it's there. Sorry. My initials are ACB. So almost ABC is the Twitter handle, easy to find there. Feel free to, shoot me a DM or whatnot. I'm pretty easy to find.
Well, thank you very much again, Andrew. Continued success to you and the team, and hopefully we'll get you back sometime in the future.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me on, Todd.
Yep. Thank you.